Sometimes I think we may have been too eager to own a home. If we had taken our time and been more discerning, we probably would not have ended up as involuntary hosts to the dozens of yearly visitors that wander onto our property from the small business next door. We live next to a funeral home, and by next to, I mean if our two buildings were any closer together, they could be condensed into a townhouse. A small strip of yellowish-green grass, barely wide enough to fit two people side by side, is all that separates our properties. And evidently, that strip belongs to my wife and me, because if we don't mow it, it doesn't get cut. Really, I should say that we live behind a funeral home, because while it is our closest neighboring property on our left side, that side of our house is actually facing its rear. The funeral home is on the corner of our block, and its entrance is situated more or less perpendicular to our front door, on the wall farthest from our house. The strange juxtaposition of our two buildings' orientations is ugly and a little uncanny, but I suppose I can't complain, because it means that I rarely have to see the funeral home's clientele, or at the very least, their living clientele. The listing for our house didn't say anything about it being next to a funeral home, and when we pulled up to view it, we were more than a little put off by the prospect of living next to a building that at any given time would most likely contain at least one dead person. But the price was right, and after months of bad luck with the housing market, along with the expiration of our apartment lease quickly approaching, we jumped at the chance to finally have a place we could call our own. Besides, my wife and I both hold a fascination with all things paranormal and macabre. We spent our entire first date gushing over ghost shows and talking about the authenticity of various haunted objects. So after viewing the house and realizing that it had almost everything that we were looking for, we managed to convince ourselves that living next to such a strange, creepy building could actually be pretty cool. And to be fair, sometimes it actually is. Other times, however, it very much isn't. Our house, at 109 years old, is definitely up there in age, but its interior was fully renovated a couple of decades before we moved in, so despite its mildly gothic exterior of gray, faded stone, arched windows, and sharp multi-pointed roof, the inside is actually mostly semi-modern. All of the surrounding houses, including the funeral home, are even older than and are of a similar build to ours, and we quite frankly love the aesthetic that it gives the entire block. Autumns feel especially cozy, and the natural spookiness that our neighborhood exudes lends itself to making Halloween especially fun for the kids, as well as any horror enthusiasts like my wife and me who happen to live in the area. Most of the time we appreciate the overall vibe, but it certainly makes things even more eerie when our guests pay their unexpected visits. Mr. Grayson, the owner and director of the funeral home, is a slightly strange, albeit decent enough guy. He, similar to his home, is getting up there in years, evidenced by his stark gray hair and wrinkly pale skin, but judging by the naked ring finger on his left hand, he does not appear to be married, nor to even have anybody else living in the home with him. He mostly keeps to himself, but he came by about a week after we had moved in to introduce himself to us. After exchanging pleasantries and partaking in a brief conversation, he steered the conversation to the business of his business. He said he hoped that living next to a funeral home wouldn't bother us much, and that the positioning of the two houses would allow us to keep our privacy, even when he hosted services. He told us that he didn't provide cremations, that he preferred to do things the old school way, whatever that meant, so we wouldn't have to worry about any unpleasant smells. And while he had a small parking lot attached to his property, often cars would wind up spilling out along the street, but service goers usually parked on the curb in front of his building and only rarely ventured into the space in front of our house. We thanked him for the heads up and said that it was nice to meet him. He turned to go, but he only made it to the middle step of our front porch before he turned back. "One more thing that I forgot to mention," he said. "You may notice that my clients tend to wander. At times they may briefly wander onto your property. You needn't worry, they won't harm you, and they will listen to you if you tell them to move on." I just thought I should forewarn you now before you find yourself positively spooked for no good reason." He turned to leave again before we could respond. "Well, have a pleasant rest of your day. And don't be a stranger, you hear? We'd love to have you over for dinner so we can welcome you to the neighborhood." He shuffled down our porch steps and made his way back to his home, disappearing inside and largely removing himself from our lives. Neither of us were particularly interested in his dinner invitation, and we doubted that he was either. Pleasantries and all that. At the time, we didn't think much of Mr. Grayson's final warning. We assumed that when he said clients, he was talking about disoriented mourners who sometimes wound up where they didn't belong. We doubted that it would be a big deal, and so promptly forgot about it after a brief discussion about the strangeness of the whole encounter. The first incident didn't come until close to a month later. By then, we had largely forgotten about Mr. Grayson and his cryptic words of caution. We rarely even saw the funeral director outside of the occasional glimpse of him on his grandiose front porch welcoming mourners on service days, and the stress of the move had our minds very far away from our first interaction with the peculiar man. It happened on a night in late spring, one of those hot, sweltering days that feel more like early summer despite what the calendar would have you believe. I woke up in the middle of the night desperately needing to pee, and seeing as our bedroom had never had a master bathroom installed during any of the house's renovations, I was forced to walk out of our room and all the way down the long hallway to the lone second-floor bathroom on the far end, hoping that my tired, lumbering footsteps didn't wake my light sleeper of a wife. I didn't turn the light on in the bathroom, so by the time I reached the toilet, did my business, and stepped back into the hallway, my eyes had properly adjusted to the darkness that enveloped me. Had I turned on the light, thus resetting my night vision, I might not have even noticed the little girl standing at the top of the staircase. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. The first thing I noticed about her was that she was wearing a pink polka dot bathing suit, which immediately struck me as odd for that time of night. The second was that she was positively soaking wet, her small frame weighed down by a heavy curtain of water that gave her clammy skin an unnatural shine, and which forced her chestnut hair to cling to her little skull like a thin sheet of plastic wrap. She stood staring at me from the shadows of the nighttime gloom, as still as death, while droplets of water fell from her swimsuit and weakly splashed against the hardwood floor at her feet. I immediately picked up on the overpowering scent of chlorine. Had this occurred only a few years later, I may have thought she was my own daughter looking back at me from the shadows, but seeing as we did not yet have any children at the time of this incident, the girl's presence completely baffled me. She stared at me with her pair of glassy, distant eyes for a few long seconds before I managed to chase away the surprise that kept me frozen in place. "Are you all right, little girl?" I asked her. No response. Are you lost?" Silence. "Where are your parents?" For several moments I thought she wasn't going to speak, until finally she found her words. I don't know." Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, and while she was looking in my direction, I realized that she was not staring at me but at a point behind me, as if I were not there at all. "What's your name?" I asked her, but before I could get a response, I heard the sound of my wife shuffling out into the hallway. When she saw me frozen stiff in the nighttime gloom, she frowned. "Who are you talking to?" she asked in her groggy, half-asleep voice. "And why does it smell like a pool out here?" "This little girl must be lost," I said. "She says she doesn't know." In the brief moment that I had turned to look at my wife, the girl had disappeared. For a while I stood completely still in the hallway, dumbfounded, at a loss for words. I may have convinced myself that I had imagined the entire encounter in my tired, sleep-deprived mind, were it not for the pungent puddle of chlorinated water that still rested at the top of the stairs. We immediately called 911, not because we were frightened of a little girl being somewhere in our house, but because we were concerned about her well-being. The police arrived fairly quickly, all things considered, and after asking a number of questions that I answered with varying degrees of confidence, they did a surprisingly curt search of our home that turned up no results. The the girl was gone. Were it not for the puddle that she had left behind, I couldn't have said for sure if she had even existed at all. I was stunned when one of the officers told me that while they would file a police report, there was nothing more they could do. "Nothing more you can do?" I said. "But there's a lost little girl around here somewhere. You aren't even going to ask around the neighborhood about her or something?" The officer, looking like he had a lot to say, seemed to weigh his words before he finally sighed and spoke. "Look, you just moved into this place recently, right? Which means you probably don't know this yet, but this isn't the first call of this type that we've had at this residence, not by a long shot." "What? You mean like that girl has been here before?" "Not exactly," the officer said. "People tend to see strange things in this house, things that aren't necessarily there." "But she left a puddle at the top of my stairs," I said, flabbergasted. "It's still sitting up there right now. You're telling me I imagined that?" "No," he said. "In fact, I'm sure you saw something, but I don't know that it's exactly what you might be thinking." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully again. "Look, you're the lieutenant's nephew, right? I think it's probably more his place to explain this to you. Give him a call tomorrow morning and he'll give you the skinny on this house. But in the meantime, rest easy tonight, knowing that there is no lost little girl in a polka dot bathing suit wandering around this neighborhood. Of that, I can assure you." His words were not at all reassuring. The police left, and after cleaning up the puddle of water that was soaking into the hardwood of the upstairs landing, my wife and I went back to bed. My mind was too preoccupied by the thought of the lost little girl to fall back to sleep. So when morning came, I groggily crawled out of bed and followed that officer's advice. My uncle is, at the time of writing this, a nearly 3-decade veteran of my town's police department. He's seen it all throughout the course of his career, including, apparently, personally going on several calls to my house back in the day. And so when I called him asking about the previous night's incident, he immediately knew what I was talking about. "Geez," he said from the other end of the line. "I didn't realize that you had moved into that house. If I had, I probably would have told you to steer clear of it before you signed anything that was legally binding." I frowned at this, despite knowing that he couldn't see it. "Why? What exactly is wrong with our new house?" My uncle waited a long time before answering. So long that I actually thought he had hung up on me or we had otherwise lost connection before he finally spoke again. "There is some weird stuff that happens at that house, kid." "I've already gathered as much," I said, trying my best to check my annoyance while speaking to my uncle. "What I don't understand yet is what exactly that means." Again, there was an uncomfortably long pause. "Let me start by telling you this. The reason that officer last night knew that the little girl in the polka dot bathing suit wasn't wandering around your neighborhood is because he knew that she had died earlier this week." I can still remember the chill that ran up my spine when my uncle told me this. The invisible line that connected our two phones suddenly felt very heavy, and only grew more dense with each passing moment of silence that followed. I knew that I needed to speak if I wanted to alleviate some of that weight. An exasperated, "What?" was all I could muster. "Yeah," he said, sounding sorry to have to be the one to tell me this. "She drowned during her swim lessons over the weekend. All of the adults in the pool were distracted with other students. And, well, did you know that a person can drown in less than 30 seconds? I hardly even heard my uncle's drowning fact. For a few seconds, I didn't even know what to say. But how is that possible when I just saw her here last night? Without looking into it, I'm willing to bet she wound up at the funeral home next to your house." "What makes you say that?" "Because the clients at that funeral home, they don't like to stay in the funeral home. I can't tell you how many calls we've gotten over the years of new homeowners seeing mysterious figures and uninvited guests in that house of yours. And each time we've looked into it, we've learned that the guests in question matched the description of recent arrivals at Grayson Funeral Home." "What? You mean like they're ghosts?" I said. "You're not telling me the entire police department believes that, are you?" "It's hard not to believe it with how many times it's happened. The facts don't lie, and all I'm doing is telling you the facts." I took a few moments to absorb this. Okay, so, assuming I believe you, what are we supposed to do now? Just live our lives in this house, never knowing the next time we're going to see another one of these visitors. There's a reason so many people have moved in and out of that place over the years. Living with ghosts certainly isn't for everybody, but you shouldn't be in any sort of danger. As far as I know, the visitors don't seem to mean any harm. They're merely lost, confused, not yet able to accept that they've died. A little push in the right direction usually sees them on their way. Usually? Some of them might be a little more stubborn than others. We've definitely gotten calls about the same figures appearing over and over again in that house. But again, they don't mean any harm. They just might inadvertently give you a fright every now and again. Right. Like how that girl last night would have made me piss my pants had I not already taken care of my bladder a few moments beforehand, I wanted to say. Instead, I thanked him for being a big help. "No problem, buddy," he said. "And if you ever have any questions about the people you see, just give me a call. I might be able to dig something up about them that will set your mind at ease." While I very much doubted that last statement, I appreciated my uncle's offer anyway. I didn't realize it at the time, but I would wind up relying on his insight a lot more than I ever would have expected. I told my wife what my uncle had told me. Being a paranormal buff, she was immediately accepting of the news, if not a little put off by it. She even seemed a little bit jealous that I had been the only one to see the girl. The only evidence she had of the spirit's existence was the chlorinated puddle of water that had been left behind. She half joked that she hoped she'd be the next one to see something paranormal, and acted as if that was for my sake, so she could carry some of the burden that our now home had bestowed upon us. It wouldn't be long before she regretted this wish. About 2 weeks passed without incident. We settled back into our home with the new knowledge that my uncle had given us. On the outside, not much had changed, but I could tell that we were both thinking about the little girl in the polka dot bathing suit more than either of us wanted to admit. We talked about her a handful of times in those 2 weeks, more about who we thought she was in life than about our brief experience with her in death. The more we thought about her, the more upset we became over the tragic end of the little girl that we had never met and had not even known the name of. Eventually, she would fade into the background, becoming just another number in the vast collection of visitors that we would gather throughout all of our years in this house. But for the time being, her presence was very much felt, and it felt incredibly raw. We could understand why so many people had moved out of this house throughout the decades. Even as paranormal enthusiasts, the weight of what we had experienced was significant, and we could only imagine how heavy it felt for others who wanted nothing to do with the ghostly interlopers that regularly found their way onto our property. And all of this was after only a single experience, but there were certainly many more to come. At the expiration of those 2 weeks, I heard my wife scream. I was cooking pasta in the kitchen, the hot pot in my mitted hands headed toward the strainer in the sink, when her terrified screech stabbed through the house like a stiletto, so shrill and horrific that I nearly scalded myself with the boiling water. I placed the pot back on the stove with as much haste as I dared to, and rushed toward the sound of her voice, calling her name and asking her if she was all right as I went. I found her in the second-floor bathroom, sitting curled up in the tub and sobbing so hard that I thought she was going to cause herself to asphyxiate right there beneath the dripping faucet. After crawling into the tub with her and comforting her for a minute or so, I managed to get her calm enough that she could tell me what had forced her into such a state. She had been cleaning the bathroom sink, her eyes focused on the bowl as she went to town with her trusty scrub brush, when she happened to look up into the mirror. Standing behind her, staring into the mirror, was a shirtless, middle-aged man, his face caked in a sickening mixture of shaving cream and blood. More of the red-hot liquid spurted from a deep, long wound in his throat, and she swore she could feel the blood's sticky warmth splashing against the back of her neck. When she turned around, he was already gone, but that didn't stop the banshee-like shriek from forcing its way out of her. She didn't remember climbing into the bathtub, but she must have raced toward it with primal expedience, where she then coiled up in fear until I arrived. We stayed in the tub for a long time after that, while she battled with her lungs to regain control of her breathing. Eventually, I helped her shaking, weak form climb out of the tub and walked her to our bedroom, where she rested for a while afterwards. No longer in the mood to eat, I threw my pasta in the trash and returned to the bathroom, where I finished her chores for her. While cleaning the sink, I noticed a small splotch of white shaving cream smeared upon the counter, which I promptly wiped away. I somehow managed to convince myself that it had been my own shaving cream, despite the fact that I had been growing a beard at the time and hadn't used the stuff in months. I reluctantly asked my uncle about this incident, and what he told me disturbed me enough that I decided I would not repeat it to my wife unless she asked me about it. To this day, she never has. My uncle told me that the man in question had recently been murdered by his wife. She had come up behind him while he was shaving, one of his old-school double-edged razor blades hidden in her hand. She sliced open his throat before he even had a chance to realize what was happening. Now she was sitting in the local jail while he was in the funeral home next door, waiting to be put to rest by his confused and devastated family. At the time, his wife had not provided a motive for the murder, and I never followed up with my uncle about it. I didn't see much good in knowing. Naturally, we discussed moving out after this. Oddly enough, my wife was the one who was more intent on staying in the house, despite her experience being significantly worse than mine was. "We've made a commitment to this house," she said, "and we're going to stick to it. There's no way we can let this place beat us that easily." She forced a smile. "Besides, both Mr. Grayson and your uncle said we don't have anything to worry about with these visitors. It's not like they can hurt us or anything." "Yeah," I said, "but they can scare you so badly that you wind up hiding in the bathtub." I was more surprised than anything else. I'm sure I won't react nearly that badly next time. My wife placed a reassuring hand on my forearm. "You don't need to worry about me. I'll be all right." "Are you sure?" I asked, unconvinced. She nodded. "Yeah, I can handle a few scares here and there if you can." I finally gave a smile back to her. It was mostly genuine. "Of course I can. It's going to take more than a few unexpected guests to scare me out of this place." And so we were in agreement, and the matter was settled. Years passed in that house. We raised a family together, a pair of beautiful daughters that became our entire world. All the while, we continued to be inconvenienced by our regular visitors. Sometimes weeks would go by where nothing paranormal happened, but other times we'd both have experiences for multiple days in a row. As it turned out, my wife had been right. She had never had as bad of a reaction as the one after her first incident. Some ghostly encounters were worse than others, but never once had we ever felt threatened by any of the presences in our home. Or at least not for a while, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. We eventually mustered the bravery to do as Mr. Grayson and my uncle had told us to, and encouraged any guests we encountered to leave. Like my uncle said, there were a few that ignored our urges and stuck around for a while after we had spoken to them, but most of them didn't put up a fight. The good ones did as we instructed, usually disappearing with such little fuss that it often took us a little while to even realize that they had left. As our two daughters grew up, we taught them how to deal with the apparitions they encountered, and soon they would even begin telling us stories about the ghosts they vanquished throughout the house. My youngest once encountered an elderly woman in our garden when she was gathering peppers for her mother, and on the same day our oldest came across a young boy around her age while she was pulling her bike out of the shed. Both of them encouraged the interlopers to move on, and both guests had listened without any complaint. I was oddly proud of my girls. It felt as if they had taken up the mantle of some old family tradition and were following in the well-trodden footsteps of their ancestors before them. Their experiences at home made them tough and difficult to frighten, and they eventually became minor celebrities at their school. Kids started coming over wanting to have paranormal experiences, and a few of them even did, or so they said. I suppose I'll never really know if they were being honest about their encounters. or if they were simply making up stories to tell their friends on the playground. But I guess it doesn't really matter. Not every visitor was the result of a recent death. As I said before, the funeral home is quite old, and some of its patrons over the decades and even centuries have chosen to stick around for much longer than they ever should have. Once, I was working under the hood of my car in the garage when I suddenly smelled cigarette smoke. I looked up and saw a man standing in front of my workbench, a lit cigarette drooping lazily in his mouth. He wore a white t-shirt tucked into a pair of dark blue jeans, which were themselves cuffed over top his pair of worn work boots. His black hair was sturdily slicked back and held in place with what looked to be a strong pomade, and was so dark and shiny that it was difficult to make out the thick layer of blood that caked the crown of his head. He was studying the bench, his arms planted against its surface, his profile facing me. "Looking for something?" I asked. He didn't turn to look at me when he responded. "You seen the monkey wrench, boss?" "No," I said, "and I think you ought to leave." "Oh, all right then." I returned my attention to my car, and when I looked in his direction again, he was gone. The smell of his burning cigarette lingered in the garage for the rest of the afternoon. There was a time one summer when my wife and I had some of our college friends over for a cookout. We had warned them that they might encounter one of our regular guests during their visit, but they all laughed it off and didn't think much of it. At night, we spent a few hours around a campfire in our backyard, swapping stories, playing games, and just generally enjoying each other's company. The group initially consisted of 5 of us, my wife and me, along with our 3 friends. But at a point that I could not, and I still cannot discern, our number increased to 6. My wife was the first to notice him sitting in an empty space between 2 of our friends, and she subtly drew everybody's attention to him. In the uneven light of the guttering fire, we could see his messy brown beard and matching hair beneath his brimmed hardy hat, as well as the Prussian blue jacket that adorned his upper body. I saw rather quickly that the area around his abdomen was significantly darker than the rest of his upper body, and in the light of the flame, I could just barely make out that the jacket had been torn to shreds there. Our friends, too frightened to move, could only watch as the man in blue sitting between them leaned forward, pulled a metal flask from his hip, and began to drink. The scent of whiskey cut through the burn of the campfire and drifted on the nighttime summer air as he drank, and in a few moments the liquor that found its way to his stomach came pouring out of the tattered hole in his coat. The blue man slowly turned his head toward our friend, seeming to notice her for the first time. He raised the flask in his hand, presenting it to her. "Care for some?" Our friend, despite our earlier warning, was too petrified to respond, and so my wife spoke in her place. "No, thank you, and I think it best that you move on." The blue man capped his flask, then followed up with a lethargic tip of his hat directed at nobody in particular. "All right." He went silent and turned his attention to the fire. The living members of our group did our best to carry on with the conversation, as if he wasn't there, and eventually one of us noticed that our number had once again been reduced to 5. But the smell of whiskey remained for some time, and an inspection of the ground near where the blue man sat revealed that the dirt was wet with the jettisoned contents of his ruined stomach. Our friends stopped making fun of our ghost stories after that. None of them have visited our home since then. Considering the age of the funeral home, I didn't think we'd ever have a guest that was older than the blue man, so you can imagine my surprise and confusion when only a few months later I encountered a Roman centurion with a bruised, swollen forehead in our basement. More baffling still was the fact that he spoke to me in English and understood me when I told him it was time for him to leave. Everything made a lot more sense when my uncle informed me that an especially intoxicated man had recently fallen to his death from a 4th-floor balcony during a Halloween party. He had apparently hit his head pretty hard when he landed. It is important to reiterate that all of the visitors mentioned up to this point never made any of us feel unsafe, outside of the occasional initial reaction of surprise or fright, and even then, the occurrences became so frequent that we weren't even startled by our guests half the time anymore. Any fear instilled in us faded not long after the visitors left, and the only returning guests we've had are the ones we failed to make leave during our first few encounters with them. But even these have all eventually passed on just the same as their predecessors had. This is all to say that not once have we ever experienced a presence in our home that we have not been able to handle, at least not until that night. It happened the winter after our oldest daughter's first birthday. My wife had to stay late at work, which wasn't unheard of, especially back in those days. On nights like those, I'd handle getting our 1-year-old settled into bed before drifting off to sleep myself shortly after, but I'd always leave a few lights on for when my wife got home, one of them being the wall lamp in the upstairs hallway. I had just gotten our daughter to fall asleep and was in our bedroom reading a book in bed while preparing to hit the hay when I happened to look toward the open bedroom door and saw the apparition standing there. She was a little girl, similar in age to that first spirit I had seen standing at the top of the stairs all those years ago. Immediately upon seeing her, I knew that something was wrong. Her presence brought with it a disturbing chill that was uncharacteristic of any other spirits we'd encountered up to that point. Plenty of them had come with strange feelings or auras that sometimes manipulated the temperatures in the room, but none of them had ever had this level of intensity to them. It made all the hairs on my body stand up, as if they had suddenly been frozen into an army of needling icicles. As we stared at each other, her in the doorway and me in the bed, I felt an overwhelming sense of terror latch onto me that I had never experienced before, and hopefully will never experience again. The hallway behind her was black with an almighty darkness, which I knew should not have been possible, since I had left the light on for my wife, and I had seen its soft glow streaming into the room out of the corner of my eye while I was reading my book. As I noticed this powerful umbra, I realized that the overwhelming energy I felt was not coming from the girl, but rather from the presence that existed in the space beyond which light could reach. And as the understanding of a fresh, terrible danger continued to bubble up within me, something happened that stood in complete contrast to every ghostly encounter that I had experienced up to that point. The girl was the one to tell me that she needed to leave, and I knew that I needed to stop her from doing so. Something in my gut told me that whatever presence existed in the void beyond the doorway was beckoning for the girl to come to it, and I knew that I couldn't allow that to happen. I knew that for her to listen to that dreadful umbra would only result in her eternal doom. I was the only thing that stood between her and the certain damnation that awaited her just beyond the edge of that cataclysmic precipice. "No, I think you should stay here for a while," I said to her, sitting up in my bed. I planted my bare feet on the chilly hardwood floor. Its cold touch steeled my nerves and fought back the cacophony of voices in my mind that screamed for me to let her leave. Let the umbra have her just so long as it would leave me alone. She seemed confused, or at least as confused as a ghost could be. "Are you sure? I really think I should leave now." Her voice sounded small, distant, and vulnerable, which only made me all the more protective of her. "I'm sure," I said. "Stay in this house for a bit, okay? You can even go play in my daughter's room for a little while. You'll like it in there. It's cozy with lots of toys and big, soft pillows." "I don't know," she said, turning to look through the doorway toward the darkness. "My friend says he's going to take me to my parents. He says they're looking for me." "Don't listen to him," I said. "He's a stranger. You shouldn't talk to strangers." She paused as if hearing somebody speak. "He says that you're a stranger." "I know your parents," I said. It felt wrong to lie to her like that, but I knew I had to do anything I could to stop her from going with the presence in the hallway. "They'll come to get you soon, but you have to stay here, okay?" The girl remained silent for a long time, while I barely so much as breathed from my spot on the bed. The room grew heavier, darker, and I found that my lungs soon struggled to take in air, as if they were freshly recovering from running a marathon. My forehead grew slick with sweat despite the chill that infested the room. My body began to burn and ache. Paradoxically, rather than escape the heat, I felt the almost uncontrollable need to crawl beneath the warm, safe covers. and hide from the powerful umbra that seemed to be slowly sweeping into the room in the form of long, black, shadowy tendrils. I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of defeat. I feared that the girl was going to follow the presence, and that she would quickly be lost to the unending darkness that so sweetly coaxed her from such an agonizingly short distance away. But soon I noticed that the dark presence was beginning to recede, until finally the light in the hallway was able to once again pierce through the weakening gloom. The terrible chill fled from the room, and the dense miasma that had been suffocating me and draining the very will to live from my bones faded back into light, breathable air. Okay, she said. I'll stay. Good, I said. And let me know if he tries to talk to you again, okay? Okay, she said again. The girl stood staring at me for a spell, while my nerves continued to strum all along my anxious body, like a mass of broken guitar strings. Reaching a shaking hand toward my nightstand, I picked up my book and forced myself to return to my reading in an attempt to calm myself down. When my body was once again my own, I looked back at the doorway. The girl was gone, and gentle lamplight bled in from the hall. Strangely enough, I was no longer worried for her. I somehow understood that whatever presence had wanted her had been thwarted that night, and that she was safe for the time being. This truth was confirmed to me when I saw her again a few weeks later, and with the umbratic presence absent, I finally told her that it was time for her to move on. When she vanished for the last time, I felt an inexplicable peace overwhelm me, and I started to cry. To this day, I don't know the extent of what the Umbra wanted with the girl, but I know now as I did back then that its intentions were nothing short of sinister. I still wonder what had caused that presence to specifically latch onto her instead of the countless other souls that drifted through our home. But I could never muster the courage to research the entity or ask my uncle for more details about the girl's death. I debated not even telling my wife about this encounter, but ultimately decided that she needed to know. I stayed up until she got home that night, much to her confusion, and immediately told her what had happened. She remained quiet for a long while after that. Neither of us slept that night. It has been the better part of 2 decades since that incident. My youngest daughter just started high school, and my uncle retired from the police service going on 5 years ago now. Mr. Grayson still holds his funeral services next door. I saw him outside welcoming mourners just last week, and I try not to think about the fact that the old man looks like he hasn't aged a day since I met him. Countless guests have come and gone in the years since that terrible night, but that dark presence has not returned. I don't know if it ever will, and I pray to God that I never have to feel what I felt that night again. More than that, though, I pray that my wife and daughters never have to experience what I went through on that night. If that shadow decides to show itself again, I just ask that it does so to me and to me alone, because I'll be here waiting for it, should it ever choose to make itself known. I already know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life in this house, ghosts and all. If they couldn't scare me away in those first few months, then they're stuck with me until the time comes that I join their ranks on the other side of that thin, translucent veil that we call death. And who knows? Maybe I'll wind up in the funeral home next door when my time finally comes, and I'll have the chance to pay this old house one last visit before I say goodbye.